Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, Q Nostalgia here, and welcome back to my Pantheon Rise of the Fallen Racial Lore series. This is the third and final video in the video series, so if you've got to this point and you've seen the other ones, I thank you for taking this journey with me. If you haven't seen the two previous videos and you're interested in doing so, you can either wait to the end of this video when I put up the links, or you can click on my channel and check them out. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Elves, the Gnomes, and the Skar. We're going to start things off with the Elves. With loyalty that is not easily won or lost, Elves carry an immortal sense of how fleeting life is, born of their own brushes with total extinction. But far more than frail survivors, they are unrivaled artists from architecture to agriculture, with arcane and physical prowess as natural as the wind, rain, and storm. Sibling hearts divide the race into two distinct groups. Ashen Elves steward Faerthale from within, eternally vigilant in watch and guard, while their Ember brethren cast an aggressive eye toward the surrounding lands, rooting out evil where it resides. To understand the Elves of Faerthale rightly, one must walk among the pages of their ancestors. It is a thick opus, full with trumpets and tragedies, begun long before their kind set upon Terminus. On their home planet, the Elves lived as one great host for 1,000 years, mastering battle, trade, and the arcane. Power was concentrated into the three realms, Guardian North, Fertile West, and Orchestral South. Yet an age of unmitigated pestilence fractured their unity. And in a climax of unrest, the militant cities of the north laid waste to the richer lands of the west. Under this calamity, the elven gods Elos and Dythir led survivors to a lush valley far in the east, the forgotten hallow of the race's birth. The sight which greeted the refugees melted their sorrow like a radiant dawn. A tree of such enormous size it was at first mistaken for a mountain, laden with clouds. Up from the heart of the teeming valley the regal tree soared, arrayed in animal and vegetative life, prismatic rainbows and falling streams. The base was half a day's journey around, even upon the swiftest horse. So powerful was the trunk in its ascent, that slabs of great rocks from far below the valley's soil had been pulled up into sired ridges. The four highest branches stretched out like bridges in the sky, though they did not altogether span the chasm of the valley. Yet in short decades, the ravenous Tormentari tracked their divorced brothers to this bountiful new home. Hallowed by hatred and joining indistinguishable ranks with the beasts of Tor, they razed the valley with infernal flame. By the end of their siege, even Lumos was scorched and dying. The Elves took flight into the lands of pestilence as desperate nomads. In this morning hour, they took as their namesake the Ashen, painting their faces from elder to infant with cinders of Lumos itself. Yet Dythir pulled the heart seed of Lumos from the desecrated tree and gave it to the Ashen Elves, while Elos bestowed a twofold prophecy, declaring that the seed would be planted anew in foreign lands. Thus the elven era of Terminus began with promise. Once a home was secured in the clefts of the Rhone Mountains, the heart seed was planted with solemn ceremony. This tree they named Lucent, the third light. Over the hundreds of interweaving years, the Ashen Elves grew alongside the mountain and the Lucent. Yet fate did not abide this sanctuary, and with the Deicide War, the Revenant ravaged King's Reach, much like the Tormentari of old did the Eastern Valley. Once more the Elves were forced to flee. Once more their holy tree was burned alive. When the battle turned in their favor, the whole of the nation ran from the silent sanctum to their tortured giant, placing innumerable hands upon the trunk. There they felt a soft warmth, not from smoldering husk, but the deepest part within. In that hour, a new branch of elves sprung from the Ashen. These are the Ember, a vibrant class who seek to return their people to the ancient days of promise on their homeworld, before the age of pestilence. These contrast with the Ashen, who seek only to prosper within the five forests around Faerthale, ambitions counterweighted by memories of the many elven sorrows. The two veins of elvenhood coexist even now, though days may be drawing near that will bond them further or tear them apart. For there is a second half to Aelus's prophecy, which warned of a third inferno for the elven race. The Ashen believe the Revenant fulfilled that requirement in blood and flame. Ember disciples aggressively protest that interpretation, claiming the third crucible is yet to come. So once again, a very traditional story for this race, much like the dwarves. It looks like we're starting off to the point in their story where we're seeing them fracturing. We're starting to see the rise of the traditional high elf versus dark elf storyline. That's what it looks like they're doing with this. The whole idea of them taking a seed and replanting it to give birth to another tree on another planet, I think it's interesting, but it has been done before. I don't know if it's been done like from planet to planet, But the whole tree of life thing and elves and their source of power, it's very typical. I'd like to talk about a race that isn't very typical right now, and that is the Gnomes. It is a splendid irony that the smallest of the foreign races contains the most mystery. Peerless in understanding and wielding of the arcane, the Gnomes are beings without true physical form due to events on their home world. Meticulous and easily absorbed in the many tasks aboard their floating city ship Skyhold, diligence and service tend to be the highest gnome virtues, along with sound innovation. Expansion is not a cultural aim, and the Gnomes have no real enemies, but some do long to face the perils and prizes of Terminus at large. Alas, Stormona, this rare planet, known as the Sun World, formed from the inside out. Her very mass was grafted together in a sphere around a thimble of a star named Elos, like a pearl gathering an oyster over itself. Through a handful of colder, distant stars shined upon Stormona, its outer crust endured under a shadowy veil of dimness, like a forgotten bride. For centuries, the Gnomes toiled under the constant dusk of the far stars, surviving not by individual might, but by collective inertia that conquered challenges of every scale. Yet an ancient myth persisted amongst the race. It spoke of a moment occurring but once a generation, when the far stars would abandon Stormona briefly and true night would fall upon their lands. In that sudden darkness, up through the very ground would whisper faint hues of light, the call of Elos, the near star. A splinter of the native Gnomes held on to the myth as truth, and on the long-awaited twilight they entered the fissures in the metallic soil of the crust. Here they beheld refracted flickers of radiant light coming from deep beneath the surface of their dim planet. This discovery touched off the first rift in Gnomen history, of which there are two, for by the time the travelers returned, the dusk light of the far stars had as well. The eldership of the Gnomes was sundered over their account of Elos' existence. This discord was evidenced by a single bright stone brought from the depths and presented to the council. For half of their number, the stone was rebuked as ordinary and dead. For the remainder, however, it was hailed as glowing and alive, albeit faint. Thus, when for the first time in its history the eldership could reach no accord, it was disbanded, permitting the growing number of gnomes to return to the search for Elos. Shortly after launch, the hopeful exploration was mired in tragedy as the gnomes learned they could venture but only so far toward Elos at a time. Their eyes were untrained for such light, which grew stronger as they neared and burned many blind at first. Their skin, too dense from the cold of the outer surface, left their bodies faint from the heat of Elos' rays. Thus it was a patient descent, stretched over many generations, that brought the gnomes to the door of the near star at last. When their elderhood finally permitted breaking through the inner crust, there drew a sight beyond imagination. Settled in an open expanse was the majestic Elos, with small planets orbiting about in undisturbed choreography. The walls of this cavernous sphere were lined with a glowing mineral new to the gnomes, which they learned held the power of Elos fire. This mineral they named Reservoir, for it held deposits of arcane energy, which could be drawn back out and into the very body of a gnome. The powers and abilities it granted were far beyond any warrior or mage. These wielders of Elos fire became known as the Arcanos. Yet this otherworldly paradise, which ought to have been beyond blemish, ushered in the second rift amongst the gnomes. All too quickly, the powers of Elos fire were sought in gluttonous measure by the Arcanos, their personal cravings overtaking a discernment for all gnomes. Foreseeing disaster, a splinter of the gnomes petitioned the Elderhood to restrict the use of Elos fire, pleading that the gnomes retreat for a brief time outside the inner crust. These were called profane by the Arcanos hierarchy, a name concocted from accusation and mockery. Though the profanes spoke with earnest fear for their brothers and sisters, the allure of the Arcanos crushed their justified concerns. The profane were exiled into a floating prison known as the Skyhold, fated to encircle Elos until she consumed them. This airborne expanse was built of spent reservoir, though the Arcanos critically misunderstood that reservoir could be infused anew. For years, the profane painstakingly extracted the resource, constructing a pillar within the heart of the Skyhold of pure reservoir. Therein they stored a measure of Elos fire. Yet as they labored in secret, the Arcanos worked ever more madly to draw ethereal power from the star. To this end, they constructed spires of pure reservoir, aiming the immense towers directly at Elos, sapping power beyond the natural limits the star freely gave. The gorge of her energy began to weaken Elos, loosing the bounds of her power in devastating surges. As her unbridled rays struck the inner crust, many of the gnomes were consumed. Yet the Skyhold, built to lock the profane away until death, bore well against the lashes of Elos for a time. When a giant hole was struck straight through the crust of Starmona, the exiled gnomes piloted the structure through it, escaping to the quiet atmosphere of their ancestors. Yet survival had not been perfect, as the bristling energy in the reservoir continued to sift through the skyhold. A dire conclusion was reached by the gnomes. They must abandon their mortal flesh or perish. When deposited on Terminus, the skyhold floated undisturbed above Whitethaw for nearly 50 years. A deep resonant hum slowly bore an inverted cone in the snow directly underneath the hulk. Otherwise the ship roosted in the skies with silent unconcern. Now with modest access for wayfarers, it stands as the capital city of the gnomes, striking in its inorganic majesty, begging more questions than the race cares to answer. Terminus has brought a return to the unified workman traits of their ancient brothers and sisters, and the gnomes may not have been so at peace in all their existence. So there you have the gnomes. Very fascinating story. I'd have to say it's probably one of the most interesting stories for any of the races in this game. I'm definitely going to be making a gnome, without a shadow of a doubt. I'm probably going to main a gnome, as a matter of fact. The fact that they're not even in a physical form, and that they're pretty much being stored inside of their armor, they're ethereal. It's just really cool. It's an interesting concept, and I always like gnomes anyways. I've always liked the fact that they're always looking to invent things. They're very science and tech savvy, which is something that I always like. So I've always gravitated towards gnomes. All puns aside, though, I do like the fact that they have a hollow planet with planets inside of it, and there's a star inside. It's very much the whole hollow Earth theory, and you know, as ridiculous as that is to me, I always thought it was a fascinating story, and I think that it's pretty cool that they put it in here. And now we finally arrive to the 9th and final race, the Skar. If there was an opposite to any good thing in every race, the Skar would stand alone in the extreme. Suicidally vicious, tribal, and short-sighted, the Skar fear only their Nine God and are there fervent only in their hatred. A ravenous desire to consume fits with their thin, predatorial size and build, and they attack to overwhelm quickly, lacking exceptional endurance. Their role on the stage of Terminus has the most uncertainty, for their battles rage as much within Skargol as outside of it. What truth can be grasped about a race that keeps no written record of its past? The futile search for knowledge regarding Terminus's most recent arrivals had been compelled more by concern than curiosity, until the Elves stole from Skargol one unfortunate informant, a young Kagan slave named Bak Noi. Her testimony has borne scrutiny in the passage of time, horrifyingly well. It was a lens that helped burn through the fog of myths and madness that attends these awful beasts, her broken, translated words piercing a veil of fear and assumption. The peculiar sovereignty Dishath consists of 9 personalities at once, or perhaps 9 separate beings in one accord. There is evidence to support both. In that age there was no Skar, but a race known as the Azan. Once nomadic, the lands of the Azan, inhabited on Dishath, were not their own, and they bartered for it as a mercenary nation, leasing their bodies to the dominant military force in the region, known as the Fasok. This name endures among the Skar as something of a harsh slur or profane rebuke, invoking immediate retribution and bloodshed. For generations, this treaty caused the tidal Azan population to wane beneath Fasok's campaign as if they were moons. Lean years saw the Azan retaining less and less of their freedom, descending into pure slavery to Fasok. Yet in this service the nation thrived, enforcing mandates of their oppressors with stark brutality, delivering savagery upon the peoples onto which they were loosed. The familial tribes within the Azan competed for the scraps of their owner, like a nation of abused vampiric hounds. If any fault could be found in their service, it was that their effectiveness was too great, their havoc too primal. Beyond this trade, the Azan had no ambition, for war was the same whether slave or free. Fate would have been gracious to grind the Azan to dust in that era. Instead, a priestess of the Nine God altered their collective course forever. A servant of Parish of the Nine, neither her original name or race have survived on record. What is clear, however, is that her aim was to unleash the Azan from slavery into a nation of warriors under her dominion. The priestess's first act of liberation was vengeance upon Fasok, which left the kingdom unrecognizable and birthed the Azan legacy of ruination. Drought, famine, and devastation attended every gain, for there was no principle of their conquest, not even retribution, only to consume. The whole of the Shoth would have been eaten away in the wake of an Azan onslaught. Thus, the Nine God interfered. Its delivery was swift, chaining the apostate priestess of Perish for 1,200 years to the Azan, a century for each nation the campaign destroyed, including their own. From the Azan, the Nine God took the ability to reproduce, though their inert genders would stay intact. As a sign to all who would encounter the banished race, the bones in their face and skull would be pushed through the skin, marked as heinously as the death they sowed across the realms. The Nine God renamed the Azan the Skar, sealing the wound of their sins for all time. Upon the priestess, the Nine God lay the greatest humiliation, transforming her into the lone producer of the Skar, with an ever-pregnant womb like that of a common colony of insects. From that day forth, she would serve as both the queen and the mother of her violent offspring. The Nine God gave her the name Avarish, calling out the black-hearted lust for consuming she imparted to the Azan. In the landfall event on Terminus, the deified Avarish perished. Those 7 Skar were pushed from her womb before she died. It is assumed by some that her death annulled the Avarish curse, as those 7 Skar were able to produce offspring, as have their descendants. Whether or not this supposition is correct, the population Skar goal is robust. The region itself is miserable to the eye, profane to the nose, and a tragedy to the land upon which its inhabitants have desecrated. A monolithic fragment of the Shoth, the aforementioned Dead Shear, towers into the Terminus clouds, the lone topographical feature, and a marvelous silhouette that terrifies in the light of day. On the ground, the roots of the Azan slave clans are still alive, breeding a chaos in Skargol, like an asylum where the prisoners are their own guards, and sometimes eat them. This culture of figurative and literal cannibalism has kept the Skar threat subdued far better than any external force could have hoped, and will likely do so for many years, if the Avarish is truly in Death's Keep. And there you have the Skar, a vicious and vile race that is not above cannibalism. One of the most interesting things about this race is I think they're going to go old school with factions on this one, and they're not going to be liked by very many people. It's going to be pretty rough to play as a Skar. You're going to have to be one of those hardcore people who doesn't mind having a rough start, who doesn't mind having to go the extra mile to get somewhere because you got to go around. You can't go through that town because everybody wants to kill you. Maybe you have to go through an underground sewer system or something, like you used to have to do with Freeport back in the day if you were an evil race, like the Dark Elves, for example. This is something that I am used to with games like EQOA and EverQuest, but I think there's a whole lot of gamers who aren't going to take too kindly to it. They might look at the Skar and say, oh, they look really cool, really badass, but they're not ready to commit to what it's like to be that badass. Nobody likes you, man. It's going to be rough getting around. And your faction, you're going to have to try to build it up. Maybe you can't build it up in certain areas. So they're going to be pretty tricky, but I think they're going to be very interesting, and I think they're going to appeal to the hardcore gamer. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. 3 videos later. If you haven't checked out the other 2, they're going to be at the end of this video. Make sure you check those out. If you're a Pantheon fan, hit that subscribe button because I will be talking Pantheon here for a very long time. If you enjoyed this video, please do not hesitate to share it around and leave a like. I thank you all for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all in my next video.